Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Dynasty Slant, powered by Pro Football Focus and brought to you by DraftKings. I'm your usual host, Michael Moore, along with our usual co-host, Russell Clay. And this evening, we have a special guest, contributor to Pro Football Focus, RotoViz et al., John Moore at the CFX on Twitter. John, how are you doing tonight?
Hey, Michael, I'm great. Glad to be with you. Russ, how's it going, man? I want to give a quick shout out to Russell because he was key for me throughout the season with various content work that I was doing. So hats off to you, Russell. I haven't got to publicly thank you yet.
There you go.
Awesome. Look at that. I got to basically hedge off of John's projections every week and then steal his info.
That's okay. We'll just act like you're calling in your dues for tonight. So
yes,
that's what we're doing here. All right. So with John on a little later, we are going to get into specifically the rookie receiving class of 2016. Maybe some undervalued guys, maybe some overvalued guys, who are the top guys, etc. But first, you guys, let's briefly cover the Super Bowl last night. It wasn't pretty. 24, I think it was 24-10, Denver in the end. Peyton Manning wins the Super Bowl. Cam Newton does not play well. I don't know. What dynasty takeaways are there last night, if any? I mean, any decisions, get made last night, or are we still rolling with Cam Newton as a quarterback one next year?
Cam's fine as long as he's not playing the Broncos. I mean, this Broncos defense, it really gives you a different perspective on that Patriots championship game because we thought it was just the Patriots line, but clearly that's sort of not what was going on there.
Now let's remind folks, Russ, where are you from again, Russ? Let's just remind everyone.
Western Mass.
There we go. Okay, so not to say you're biased, but you're a little biased. But I don't know. What about you, John? Anything you saw last night that maybe maybe changes your opinion a little bit heading into the offseason?
No, I mean, I think on a macro level, you don't react to just one game like this. I mean, I think when Devin Funchess made that comeback play across the middle and high-pointed that ball, that was like, whoa, there's some Devin Funchess flash, if you will. But, I mean, he had a relatively quiet game, as did most of the offensive skill players in last night's game overall. But that kind of caught my eye. But other than that, I don't know if there was anything too much else that I would mention.
Yeah, it was, like we said, it was pretty ugly, but I don't think it affects your feelings on anyone one way or the other. So
I'm slowly coming around on C.J. Anderson. I wasn't as high as most coming into the year, but I think this sort of playoff run, I think he could be the starting running back next year, and that's an intriguing backfield to have a hold on.
Just one other thing that just popped into my head is, what do you guys think is going on with Demaryius Thomas? For the whole playoff run, seven catches, 60 yards. I mean, I wonder a couple things really. I know that he got paid last offseason. I know that there was the big to-do about his mom finally getting to see him play a game in person after being incarcerated for all those years. Like, I wonder if it was just kind of like a weird year with those things going on, or if there's like something more systemic wrong with him.
I don't know. I think he had a Peyton Manning problem for most of the year. I mean, look, he didn't have the same quarterback this year he had in previous years, and I think that severely affected him. What about you, Russ?
There could be a little bit of a motivation thing going on, but it seems like his play in general has regressed, and in the dynasty landscape, you can't really have that as a receiver right now because there's so many young wide receivers shooting up, especially in terms of ADP. So, I mean, I'm not buying him at all this offseason. I was not even the regular season. He played reasonably well with the targets he was given, but it certainly wasn't the Demaryius we had become used to, I suppose.
So is he still a wide receiver 2 for you guys heading into next season, or is he fringy wide receiver 1, or where does he land as of right now?
See, that's a tough question because when you start to look at sort of the beginning of the second round in a startup draft, do you want to take him or do you want to take say, I don't know, a young up-and-coming player. I don't know where Amari Cooper's ADP is, but I'm assuming it's somewhere around the late first or early second. I mean, would you really take Demaryius over him right now?
No.
I don't think there's any way. So you kind of keep going down the list, and you're like, I still probably wouldn't take Demaryius over any of those premium guys.
Well, yeah, and I mean, just Denver as a whole is going to be a fascinating story this offseason. I mean, let alone the whole Peyton Manning thing, which, look, I think we all assume he's going to retire, and he should. I mean, that's the way to go out. But, then what does Denver do? Do they sort of think Brock is the short-term answer and long-term answer? Do they completely tear it down and start over? I mean, it's one of those things that, hey, they won it now, so, like, all bets are off. You just don't know what they're going to do now. So. All right. Well, enough about the present. Let's look into the future, boys. And first up for this Dynasty Slant season, we're going to look at the rookie receiver class of 2016. That's why we brought both of you guys in tonight. So let's just kick off with some general strategy questions. What methods, indicators do you guys find helpful in evaluating receivers? And John, since you're the guest, you can kick us off.
Yeah, well, I mean, right off the bat, I think one thing that is always important to remember in this conversation is that opportunity matters. And so even if you aren't as crazy about a particular guy, it's always important to remember that if they get drafted in the top 2 or 3 rounds, that, in a lot of cases might supersede, whatever your pre-draft thoughts were about them, just because that opportunity to get on the field and contribute matters. So for me, just how I effectively factor in the scouting community's thoughts on a player is by paying attention to draft position. Once we get beyond that, the things that I like to look at, I write a lot about age. When guys are first good in college tends to be somewhat related to when they are good in the NFL. Guys that don't break out, don't become significant contributors in their offense until their age 22, 23 seasons have a less chance of success in the NFL than guys who break out at 18 or 19. So that's a factor that I always pay attention to. And then just the things like market share of yards, career stats, like how many yards and touchdowns did they get in their career. That's something that I found to be meaningful. Special teams. This is something that I wrote about last year and I think was sort of putting numbers and doing some of the research behind a speculation that, if this guy's a great punt returner, this guy's a great kick returner, they're probably going to be pretty good. But in fact, that has proven to be a significant variable. And then as far as the combine goes, I know a lot of emphasis gets placed on that, but when it comes down to it, really what I'm looking for is like weight, how thickly built is a guy, BMI, sometimes comes across as a variable that I look at there, and then vertical jump. After that, not a whole lot matters, at least through my worldview.
Yeah, I think one of the main things my focus has been on, I'd say the last year or so, especially with this class, is usage, how players are used in their college offenses, and what that potentially means towards translating. And John wrote some stuff on kickoffs last year, and that has, when you really look back at some of that type of usage, who was primary kick returners in the college level, that definitely has some nice indicators. I think rushing yards for receivers is something that I like to put an emphasis on, especially for players that project as sort of slot receivers. That's the type of stuff I look at. And then I look at sort of, again, we get into the market shares of yards and stuff like that, but I also like to look at what the player did at the height of their skill, sort of what their ceiling season was in college and how dominant were they at the college level. Because I think when you look back or sort of look at the top college receivers, a lot of them translate into sort of being the best NFL receivers. There aren't many NFL receivers that are dominant in the NFL and not dominant in college,
Yeah, and it seems like if a receiver they have to essentially show flashes of greatness early on and sustain it, is what I'm hearing, right? Meaning they can't have like the breakout senior season. I mean, it's possible, don't get me wrong. There's probably plenty of examples of that. But if they show that early on, freshman, sophomore year, chances are that they're just going to keep progressing at that level. Is that about right?
And a player can sort of supersede a bad trait or a bad indicator, something like that. But we're talking on a macro level right now in sort of terms. Generally, what you look for size, you look for strong college production, you look for elite athleticism.
Yeah, just to clarify on that size point, though, because I think that people get confused about height and weight.
Yeah.
I think people think if a guy's taller, that's good. If a guy is shorter, that's bad. I like to look at their BMI, which is essentially how thick are they for their height. And so, for example, if you think about like let's say like Justin Hunter, who is like 6'3", I think like 195-ish, and then you look at a guy like Brandon Cooks, for example, who was like 5'10", 190. You know, a guy who is built very solidly like Cooks was, I give preference to over a guy who is just tall. I just want to clarify that because I think there's some confusion in the community about height versus weight and what that means.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I have a question for you guys. If somebody's looking, let's use Odell Beckham just as an example, because obviously, like you said, Russ, he's got a fairly high ceiling compared to his first 2 years in the league. What were some of the traits coming out of the draft that you guys saw that were good indicators of his success, so that people drafting in rookie drafts this year in dynasty leagues can sort of follow not the same template exactly, but something similar. What were using Beckham as an example? What were the things he did really well that sort of proved your guys' hypothesis?
Well, that was sort of a hot button topic in the community, but. In terms of his production at LSU, I mean, we're seeing it now. Compared to sort of the last 5 to 7 years of receivers that came through there, he actually was the most productive to sort of run through there, and there were quite a few solid prospects that did run through there, and he just had a lot of positive indicators, especially at the combine and stuff like that.
Yeah, Beckham for me is a guy that at the time, when he was coming out, I had him, I think, as maybe my 6th wide receiver in that draft, which I know sounds silly, and why would you admit that? But I want to be transparent with this because I think ignoring your past misses is the surest way to not get better. And in that, it was guys like Sammy Watkins, Mike Evans, Allen Robinson, Brandon Cooks.
Yeah.
Like those were the guys that I had above him, which, in retrospect, I obviously would have liked to been full go on the Beckham thing, but spending a lot of time looking at what I missed about him, the things that in retrospect, he was an outstanding special teams performer for LSU. That was something that I didn't give him enough credit for at the time. I think as far as his athletic profile, he was slightly above average in everything, but he wasn't necessarily like elite. And I think the thing with him too that threw me off was that Brandon Cooks was, like, in my opinion, such an elite small wide receiver prospect that I paid more attention to him than Beckham, even though Beckham was a lot like Cooks except a little bit bigger. The other thing that I really like about Beckham's profile in retrospect, he was absolutely beastly on a per target basis. By my numbers, he had a 12.8 yards per target figure in that senior season, which is one of the probably 15 best if you go all the way back to 2005 and look at all college receivers in their final season. So he was really elite there. And then as far as market share, because that's something that I obviously harp a lot on, and people say, why haven't you mentioned kind of your key thing that you like to look at? He was good at that. He was at 35% of his team's market share. He was about 21 years old in his final season, which is right about where he should have been. And so I think in retrospect, I think that class was really deep. I think there were some other shinier objects to look at besides Beckham. But in any given year, if you have a guy ranked as your 6th wide receiver in a class, let's say, that still means that they're a 30 to 35 overall kind of projection for you. And obviously with Beckham, I thought him going at 12, and especially to my favorite team, the Giants, I was not thrilled about that. But obviously the results have been different, and I've learned from that experience.
Well, and look, let's also be clear. The guys you had ahead of Beckham, Allen Robinson, Watkins, Evans, those guys are pretty good too. It's not like you, whiffed on some guys, ahead of Beckham. I mean, and like you said, it comes down a lot to opportunity too. I mean, not to say that, Allen Robinson or Brandon Cooks would be doing have the same numbers as Beckham would in New York, but again, it's sort of splitting hairs at that point because all those guys you mentioned are pretty good. So.
And I think this hits on a big point is when you break down the production, you have to have the proper context of what it means, and I think market share does a really good job of that. Because I think a good example, we brought up Devin Funchess earlier. I mean, he only had 700 receiving yards in his senior or junior season, but it was such a large portion of Michigan's sort of receiving total yards that it was actually a much better number than it appeared to be. So I think there's a lot of little things like that are better indicators than necessarily looking at the raw sort of production.
Yeah. Well, okay, so using all of that knowledge, gentlemen, let's look at this year's wide receiver class. Last year's class, I don't know, what would you guys say? Average, above average? I mean, you had Amari Cooper, obviously, who had a great year. Not a whole lot of guys after that compared to the previous year where you had Beckham, Watkins, Evans, Allen Robinson, etc. So where does 2016, this upcoming class, rank for you guys compared to the last couple of years?
I actually, compared to the last 2 years, I was actually pretty high in the 2015 class when all things were said and done. I thought Parker, White, and Cooper, they would all be vying for the #1 wide receiver in this class, in my opinion. So I do like those other two classes more, but this class does have depth on them, and I think that's going to be an interesting storyline to follow as we sort of get through the combine and through the draft.
Yeah, and I think if I can actually go back one more year, the 2013 class, that was the one that had DeAndre Hopkins, Tavon Austin, Justin Hunter, Cordell Patterson, Keenan Allen.
Robert Woods.
Yeah, Robert Woods. Yeah. To me, this class feels similar to that. For that year, Nuke was pretty clearly my #1 guy. I think ultimately Treadwell will probably be that for me this year too. But then also, if you look at it, that class had a couple like smaller, explosive type receivers in the form of Austin and Kenny Stills. I think this year, when you look for some of those like do-it-all types of smaller guys who could be explosive, you've got like a Corey Coleman, a Pharoh Cooper, who could fall into that. You had a couple like long, lean guys. I mentioned Justin Hunter earlier. Terrence Williams, I think you could also put into that batch. And I think for this year, that's maybe like a Josh Doctson. That's maybe a Rashard Higgins. Yeah. Your Cordell Patterson, really divisive within the community. What should this guy do? How high should he go in the NFL? I think that's probably what Braxton Miller is in this class. And then just your solid sort of average size, could be successful in the NFL in the right role that Robert Woods, Keenan Allen fell into. I think in this year's class, that would be like a Tyler Boyd, Sterling Shepard. And so I think, to me, that was just what immediately popped into mind because that class didn't have a lot of high-end talent, but it had a lot of like pretty good talent, which is how I feel about this one with Treadwell at the top and a lot of pretty good guys, just depending on where they land throughout the rest of the top 100.
So if we're looking at, say, rookie drafts a few months from now, I think what I'm hearing is, if you've got a top pick, obviously you can go with Treadwell, but if you don't, there's not a whole lot of other guys that you should be, looking to move up for or trying to make deals for, that there's enough depth where, hey, in picks 2 through 12, let's say, of a rookie draft, like you're okay at 2 or 12 when it comes to receivers. Is that about right?
Especially in terms of the receivers, the teardrops aren't as big as normal years. I can see pretty much my top 3 are Treadwell, Coleman, and Boyd right now, but I don't see a huge difference or like a chasm or anything between sort of 4, 5, and 6 either. And obviously we're going to have to see how the combine and how draft position plays out before we sort of figure out exactly what's going on here, but I think there's going to be a lot of interesting spots these guys fall to, and it's going to be a nice late first round this year.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I just did a like a pre-combine rookie mock over at RotoViz with some guys from the industry, Sigmund Bloom, Davis Maddock, Matt Friedman, Russell, you were in it. And looking all the way down through, I think as far as like pick 18, like I feel like anything from like 9 overall to 18 overall, there's a lot of really interesting names that could go in that range. But yeah, I mean, I think as far as the wide receivers go at this point, to me, Treadwell feels like the one guy that I would right now, sort of regardless of the combine or where he goes, assuming that it's in the top 15 overall, I would take him in the top 3 picks. But then after that, I think there could be a lot of fluctuation in this group. That's Coleman, Doctson, Ohio State's Michael Thomas, Sterling Shepard, Tyler Boyd, Leonte Carew, and so forth.
Yeah, and I think the value is pretty clearly hedging towards Treadwell. I think he's going to be the asset regardless of what, even if he drops a little bit, I think the community in general and where he's going to go in your rookie drafts is pretty much sealed, barring him falling out of the first round. So I think he's a really solid asset in general, even if you don't like him as a prospect as much. Yeah, beyond the top 2 picks, which Zeke Elliott is pretty much penciled in as him and Treadwell are the top 2, but beyond that, yeah.
Well, and as we all know, I mean, things will shake out a lot more between now and the combine and the draft and stuff like that. So, all right. So at this stage, we've talked about sort of the heavy hitters, but who are some guys that, at least at this moment in time, you guys feel are maybe a little undervalued, that are going later in those rookie mock drafts that you think you should keep an eye out for?
Okay, so I really like Rashard Higgins. I go back to his 2014 season and look at what he did there. He had over 90 catches, 1,600 yards, and averaged over 18 yards reception.
Wow,
And
you combine those words for us. It's okay.
And he also led the nation in yards after catch. So I'm looking at him with some really positive indicators in that season. And this year was kind of a down year for him. I think people are sort of really basing their evals on him right now off the 2015 season. But I think when you look a little closer into that 2014 season, he really jumps off the page.
Yeah, I think a few names that I'll point out, and I'm going to draw from that mock draft we did and look at guys in the second round. I'm really intrigued by Pharoh Cooper out of South Carolina. I mentioned earlier, and Russ mentioned earlier, some of that all-around production that you'd like to see from a guy. And for me, Cooper checks those boxes. So 2014 and 2015, he went over 950 yards and 8 touchdowns receiving in both of those years, and was well past the 30% mark as far as market share of his team's receiving game. That's one thing, let's just get that out of the way. But what really gets me excited about him is how he was asked to contribute everywhere else on the field. So, for example, he had over 200 rush yards in 2013 and 2014, and over 100 again this year. For his career, he was used pretty heavily as a punt and kick returner. And then even down to the fact that this is just reading between the lines. Pharoh Cooper's a guy. He played defensive back in his first season, 2013, mixed in a little bit as a gadget player. The fact that as a gadget player and then being incorporated more as a receiver as his career went on, he threw 16 passes in his career, and ultimately 4 of them went for touchdowns. The fact that the coaching staff is essentially in this data saying, we just want him to get the ball however we can get him the ball because we know good things are going to happen. When, especially at an SEC program, a guy's asked to contribute in all of these ways and even play on both sides of the ball at times, that to me just is indicative of an elite athlete, an elite talent, and a guy that is the kind of player that earns the trust of a coaching staff in the form of being asked to do all these different things.
And he really came out of nowhere in that 2014 season. As he mentioned, he played on defense the season before, but he had 20 carries that season. He didn't have any receptions, and then he comes in that year, averages 16 yards per reception, and he also it's a lot harder to average that high of a yards per reception when you're running the ball that much. I believe he had 27 carries. Once you start to get into that type of usage, if they can retain efficiency, that's a really positive indicator. So I'll be interested what his 40 is and what type of speed he has. If he's a 4.55 guy, that doesn't really bother me. But I mean, I think I could be surprised here. I think he might run a little faster than even he looked. So and another guy in sort of that same vein, I'm looking at Byron Marshall from Oregon. He only played a few games in 2015, but he made a full transition from basically full-time running back in the 2013 season, where he ran for 1,000 yards, to receiving for 1,000 yards in the 2014 season, and they also kept using him in the rushing game there as well. So he's a really impressive player that isn't being talked about much right now, but I think some of the indicators from those first two seasons are really impressive to me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, Michael, I just was going to jump in with one other guy. Is your comment specific to?
Well, no, it was just I was gonna, both guys you just mentioned, both you guys are very flexible and very, I guess the term is well-rounded, which is especially, I think, important for rookie drafts before the actual NFL draft. Because that sort of gives you the best shot of getting some value for that guy. Because look, no matter where he goes, they're hopefully going to find a spot for him, as opposed to being, I don't want to say a one-trick pony, but if he can do a lot of different things, that just opens up his chances to contribute early on. But anyway, John, what were you had one more guy to add on the undervalued list?
Yeah, and this is a guy who went in the third round of this rookie mock that we just did, as did Byron Marshall, who was Russell's mentioned there just a minute ago. And I'm going to go with Malcolm Mitchell. This is a guy out of Georgia, and he has a little bit of the same characteristics that Pharoh Cooper does. He was actually picked by Steve Palazzolo from PFF at the 26th overall pick in the rookie mock. And what I really like about Malcolm Mitchell, this is a guy that came into Georgia very highly touted as a recruit, played a little bit of defense early on, got mixed in with special teams earlier in his career. But what ultimately I like about his profile is that he's got sort of the best of both worlds as far as the age production profile that I like. So right out of the gate in his age 19 season at Georgia, all the way back in 2011, he accounted for 26% of Georgia's receiving yards, which is pretty solid for a 19-year-old. In raw numbers, that was 665 yards and 4 touchdowns. Then he really kind of fell off, dealt with some injuries, was moved around. How exactly is Malcolm Mitchell going to get used? And really the 12 season was down. He was hurt in 13. 14, he was kind of coming back. And then this year, again, in his age 23 season, he was up at a whopping 36% of Georgia's receiving yards. For his career, he ended up with 2,300 yards, 16 touchdowns. I think he's going to clock in probably right around 6 feet, 200 pounds, and he's a guy that I think could really be underappreciated at this point in the process.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to that being well-rounded part, especially this early on in rookie draft stuff. So, all right, so that was a couple of guys that are undervalued at this point. Let's go to the maybe trickier part, some guys that are currently being overvalued. I think we're all, in agreement on Treadwell. That's he's going to be at the top of the class. But other than that, who are some guys that you see going too early, or maybe too early for your own comfort level? Russ, let's start with you.
So I'm going to go with Michael Thomas from Ohio State, but not because I don't like him as a prospect, but I just feel like he's being sort of consensusly ranked over players I really like. So it's not really a knock on him. I just never really I don't see the flash in his game that I necessarily see in sort of Tyler Boyd or Corey Coleman, who caught 20 touchdown passes in 8 games this year. I just don't see what he's done so far in his career that makes him a better prospect than sort of those two plus Treadwell.
Okay. John, you're up.
Yeah, I think the other day Josh Doctson went 4th overall in that rookie mock, and for me that was a little bit high for Doctson. I think if you're looking at players who are going to fall in that, let's say 6'2", 195-pound range, I like Rashard Higgins out of Colorado State. I like Tyler Boyd out of Pitt more than I do Doctson. I mean, ultimately, I think that he's a good prospect. But just for fun, even today, like Matt Friedman and I were goofing around, and we did just a 1-round mock on the podcast. And Doctson actually didn't get picked in the first 12 picks. And so maybe Matt and I are a little bit biased, whatever it is. But I think just even that disparity of him going 4, him not going in the first round, I think he's kind of a guy who's maybe a little bit propped up right now. I think I've even seen him as high as like a top 15 overall pick in the real draft, being projected in that range, which would make me pretty nervous.
I'm pretty confident he can translate to the NFL level, but I think it's going to be as a deep threat. You look at his production and you look at sort of how he was used at TCU, and he's a really good deep threat, and he has really good ball skills, and he can go up and get it, and he tracks the deep ball well. So I have him down as a deep threat right now. I don't know that he has enough everywhere else to sort of bring it around and be a complete receiver in the NFL. I think he has a really good trump card in that deep ball, and I think he could eventually see 100 targets and be a really positive contributor, sort of like a lower-ish end, like Martavis Bryant type impact, but I don't necessarily see a featured guy in Doctson.
Well, I was going to say, it sounds like more Martavis Bryant, less Antonio Brown for you, if we're sticking to teammates there. And to sort of add on to what you said, John, I think I saw Doctson as high as 7 to San Francisco in an ESPN mock draft, which the 49ers are my personal team, which if that happens, I don't know what they're doing. But
is that a chuck the remote at the TV situation?
Well, it's like, who's going to throw it to him? Let's figure that out first. But that's fine. I digress. All right. So that was a couple of overrated, underrated guys. So let's just say, rookie mock draft right here, right now. Who are your top 3 receivers in this class as of today? And John, we'll let you go first.
Well, thank you.
You are the guest, so.
Yeah, well, I think until somebody else does something crazy at the combine or gets drafted higher than him, I think it's going to be hard for me to have Treadwell outside of the number 1 spot. He's a guy that even if his overall season profile isn't where I would quite like it to be, it was close enough. And if you sort of cut out the first maybe 3 games and just look at the home stretch of the last 10 for him, then it looks even better. So he's going to be 1. I'm going to put Tyler Boyd at 2. Tyler Boyd out of Pitt. He's a guy that I wrote about right before his bowl game. Basically, if you take Tyler Boyd in his 2014 season and did like that blind resume thing they do for March Madness and looked at like player A, player B without a name attached to him, if you looked at his 2014 season compared to Amari Cooper's, you would take Tyler Boyd's on-field profile just about every single time, I think, and that's pretty remarkable that for his age and pretty similar size to Amari Cooper, I think at the end of the day, maybe a little smaller. I think that he's a guy that will be a great value for NFL teams, probably in the bottom of the first round or the top of the second. And then at 3, I'm going to go a little bit off the grid, and I'm still trying to figure out what I really think about this 3rd spot. But for now, I'm going to go with Leonte Carroo. This is a guy who metrically his season this year was as good as any season that I can find in recent memory, like period. He had the high market share, he had the high yards per target, He had, I think, 3 games with 3 touchdowns. He's just he did it all that you could ask for him. His age profile checks out, and coming in right about 6 feet, 215 pounds. He's rock solid. I don't think he's going to be the most athletic guy, but I can see him being just a terror of a number 2 kind of guy who has a pretty solid upside, I think.
All right, Russ,
Yeah,
you're up.
to hit on Boyd, he's my number 3 as of now. The 2015 season, he took a real role reversal in terms of what he did for the Pittsburgh offense. Their quarterback situation was really, really below average, so he kind of pretty much played close to the line of scrimmage the entire year, both in the receiving and running game. So I think if you're gonna do sort of film study or go back and research, I would look at that 2014 season. Like I believe that's what you mentioned, John. 2014 season. Yeah.
Yep.
And Corey Coleman's my number 2. I just think what he did this year in those first 8 games when he had his starting quarterback, Seth Russell, was pretty much incredible. It puts him in the same sort of tier as a Larry Fitzgerald in terms of what he did in junior year college production. I think he profiles as a deep threat, but athletically, I think he can pretty much do it all. I think he's going to be an elite deep threat. And I think he can add on to other parts of his game, but he's definitely got that going for him right now, and that's more than you can say for pretty much most of the players in this draft class. And to hit on Treadwell really quickly. I was so ready to sort of be a hater if he didn't come in and have this awesome junior year.
Me too.
But he just hit all the qualifiers of everything I needed to be in on him as sort of that clear overall 101. So he just barely reached the mark in everything this year.
Well, yeah. So I think, it's fair to say it won't be a whole lot of drama at the top, but after that, it could be a free-for-all. So,
absolutely.
All right. Well, that concludes this edition of the Dynasty Slant. John Moore, we thank you for coming on. Follow him at the CFX with an X on Twitter. Russell Clay, usual co-host, and I'm Michael Moore. We will be back next week with another edition of the Fantasy Slant.